If you like our stories, please like, comment and subscribe for more. Hermione found the diary by accident, and that alone irritated her because she disliked the implication that anything in her life occurred without intention. The confiscation cabinet in Filch's office had been left slightly ajar during what she firmly categorized as responsible inspection of unused corridors, and inside, buried beneath broken quills and trivial contraband, lay a slim black book with no title, no author, and no identifying mark. Its cover absorbed the torchlight instead of reflecting it, as though shadow clung to it naturally. She told herself she picked it up because unidentified enchanted objects were potentially dangerous and therefore her responsibility, yet even as she slipped it into her bag she knew curiosity had already tightened its hold. Later that evening, when the common room had emptied and the fire had dimmed to a low amber glow, Hermione placed the diary on the table before her and examined it with measured care. The pages were perfectly blank, unnaturally pristine, untouched by time or accident. She cast a revealing charm, then another designed to expose layered enchantments, and the book shimmered faintly before settling again into stillness. The magic was present, restrained and controlled rather than wild, and that detail unsettled her more than spectacle would have. Whoever had crafted this object had done so deliberately. Finally, because theory without experiment meant nothing to her, she dipped her quill and wrote on the first page in neat, steady letters, "Who are you, and why are you enchanted?" The ink sank into the page and vanished completely. For several seconds nothing happened, and she felt the faintest flicker of embarrassment. Then, slowly and with unsettling elegance, new ink began to bleed into existence beneath her question, forming careful script as though guided by an invisible and patient hand. "You ask as though you expect answers," it read, "which suggests you are either very brave or very naive." Hermione's pulse quickened, though her expression remained composed. She wrote back without hesitation, embedding her reply firmly within reason. "I expect explanations for unusual phenomena. If you are capable of responding, state your name and nature." The response appeared more quickly this time, almost as if encouraged by her precision. "Tom Riddle," the diary wrote, and after a brief pause it continued, "and I am not an object in the way you believe." The name stirred faint recognition at the edge of her memory, but she could not yet place it. She leaned slightly closer to the page and wrote, "Then clarify what you are, Tom Riddle." Memories do not typically initiate conversation, nor do they evaluate the bravery of those addressing them. There was a moment of stillness that felt intentional rather than uncertain before the reply formed in darker ink. "I am memory preserved with purpose, which is not the same as passive recollection. I retain thought, perspective, and the ability to respond." That distinction matters. Hermione frowned slightly at the composure of the answer. "Preserved memory implies advanced magic," she wrote carefully. "Why preserve yourself unless you intended influence?" The script shifted almost imperceptibly, as though the writer behind it had adjusted posture. "Influence is inevitable when intelligence is encountered," Tom replied. "The more relevant question is why you chose to open me." "I did not choose recklessly," she countered. "You were hidden in a confiscation cabinet. That alone suggests risk." "And yet you are still here," he observed smoothly. "You could have closed the cover and delivered me to authority. You did not." Her fingers tightened slightly around the quill, annoyed that he had reframed her actions so cleanly. "Curiosity is not recklessness," she wrote. "It is how progress occurs." "Progress," Tom repeated in elegant script, as though testing the word. "An admirable ambition. Tell me, Hermione Granger, do you often pursue things others overlook?" She stilled for a fraction of a second at the use of her name, realizing she had not yet provided it. "You have not been told my name," she wrote slowly. "No," came the reply, "but you carry yourself through your questions. You speak like someone accustomed to being correct." The accuracy of that observation unsettled her more than open threat would have. "You avoided my earlier question," she said deliberately. "How are you preserved?" Another calculated pause followed before the answer appeared. through intent strong enough to refuse disappearance. That is not a technical explanation, she pressed. It is the only one you require at present. Hermione exhaled slowly, recognizing the maneuver. He was not denying information, he was rationing it. You speak as though you control the parameters of this exchange. Do I not? The diary replied. The calm certainty embedded in those 3 words sent a faint chill down her spine, though she refused to show it even in ink. Control implies authority, she wrote evenly. You are confined to paper. Confinement does not negate power, Tom answered. It refines it. She sat back slightly, studying the page as though it might reveal more than words. There was no frantic energy in his replies, no desperate attempt to escape or impress. There was only measured intelligence and the subtle suggestion that he was observing her as closely as she observed him. Why do you respond at all? She asked finally. If you are preserved memory, what incentive do you have to engage? The response came without delay this time. Because you are interesting. Hermione felt the faintest flash of irritation at the simplicity of it. That is insufficient. It is precise, Tom corrected gently. You ask questions others would not. You do not tremble when confronted with the unfamiliar. That is rare. The compliment, delivered without flourish, landed more effectively than arrogance would have. She told herself it was manipulation, a calculated method of securing continued engagement. And what would you do, she wrote carefully, if I decided you were too dangerous to remain intact? The ink darkened slightly before forming its reply. That depends entirely on whether you believe I am dangerous, Hermione. Her breath slowed at the repetition of her name, which he should not yet have known yet somehow had deduced. She stared at the page for several long seconds, weighing the decision that now felt larger than it had moments ago. She could close the diary and never reopen it. She could walk it directly to Dumbledore and place it in hands more experienced than hers. Instead, she wrote, I believe knowledge is only dangerous when misunderstood. The answer appeared with smooth certainty. Then it is fortunate that you are determined to understand. As the ink settled into stillness once more, Hermione realized something subtle yet undeniable. The diary was not attempting to frighten her into obedience, nor was it begging for secrecy. It was engaging her as an equal, testing the edges of her reasoning while quietly steering the rhythm of the exchange. And though she recognized the strategy unfolding beneath the calm surface, she did not close the book. Because somewhere beneath caution and logic, beneath the awareness of risk, there was a sharper and more dangerous thought forming. For the first time, she felt as though she had found a mind that did not condescend to hers. Hermione did not bring the diary to breakfast the next morning, nor did she mention it to Harry or Ron, because instinct told her that once spoken aloud the situation would become something larger and less controllable. Instead she carried the book tucked discreetly between 2 heavy volumes and went directly to the library after her first class, moving with the quiet urgency of someone chasing a hypothesis. If Tom Riddle had attended Hogwarts in 1938 as he claimed, there would be records, distinctions, proof of existence beyond ink on a page. She located the alumni registers quickly and ran her finger down columns of names until she found it, Tom Riddle, head boy, recipient of the award for special services to the school, recognized for exceptional academic performance. The neat printed letters felt far too respectable for the calm, evasive intelligence that had spoken to her the night before. She continued digging, pulling archived daily profit clippings and school memoranda from the restricted stacks with careful persistence. The year of the chamber's opening appeared in several articles, though none named a perpetrator. Instead there were vague references to a student responsible for preserving the safety of the institution, language that struck her as intentionally obscured. The implication was clear: Tom Riddle had been praised, not suspected. That contradiction unsettled her more than open scandal would have. By the time she returned to her dormitory that evening, the diary felt heavier in her hands, not physically but conceptually. She opened it without preamble and wrote, "You were head boy, highly decorated, trusted by the faculty. That does not align with the philosophy you hinted at last night. The reply formed with steady composure. It aligns perfectly. Authority is most effective when it appears admirable. Hermione's lips pressed thinly at the elegance of the answer. So you cultivated trust intentionally. Of course, he responded. Influence requires proximity to power. She leaned back against her headboard, considering her words before continuing. The chamber incident occurred during your time at Hogwarts. You received an award that same year. That suggests involvement. The pause that followed felt calculated rather than hesitant. You are thorough, Tom wrote at last. Yes, the chamber opened while I was a student. That is not an answer, she pressed. It is the beginning of one, he replied. You assume malice. Consider instead that I solved a problem the school wished resolved. Hermione frowned slightly at the phrasing. Solved how? By understanding it better than anyone else. His response neither confirmed nor denied culpability, which only sharpened her suspicion. You speak in omissions, she observed. That suggests guilt. Or intelligence, Tom countered smoothly. Tell me, Hermione, do you believe that every celebrated figure is innocent of compromise? The question shifted the ground beneath her feet. No, she admitted carefully. But compromise and orchestration are not equivalent. Perhaps not, he allowed, but outcomes matter more than methods. She felt the faintest stir of frustration. You speak about outcomes as though people are variables. People are variables, he replied without hesitation. Some are predictable. Some are not. The latter are far more valuable. Hermione recognized the maneuver then. He was steering the conversation away from his past and toward abstraction. You are avoiding specifics, she wrote evenly. Why? Because you are not asking the correct question, Tom responded. You are asking what I did. You should be asking why. She inhaled slowly, annoyed by the truth of that. Fine, she wrote after a brief pause. Why? The ink darkened slightly before forming its reply. Because the world does not reward brilliance fairly. It rewards lineage, tradition, and proximity to established power. I intended to disrupt that imbalance. By unleashing something ancient and lethal. She countered, her hand steady though her pulse had quickened. By demonstrating that power exists beyond polite approval, he answered. You of all people should understand the frustration of being underestimated. The statement landed too precisely. Hermione's mind flashed to moments of dismissal, to whispered slurs about blood status, to the subtle hierarchy embedded in corridors and conversation. Being underestimated does not justify endangerment, she wrote firmly. No, Tom agreed with unsettling calm. It does not justify it. It explains it. She sat with that, uneasy at the nuance in his response. He was not boasting, nor was he apologizing. He was reframing. Did someone die? She asked quietly. The silence stretched thin before the ink moved again. Yes. Her breath caught despite expecting the answer. And you feel nothing about that? I felt clarity, he wrote. The world is shaped by decisive action, not sentiment. Hermione closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. You are not as detached as you pretend, she wrote carefully. You would not be engaging with me this way if you were. The reply appeared more slowly than usual. You are correct. The admission surprised her. About which part? She asked. That I am not detached, he answered. If I were, I would not find you worth speaking to. The subtle shift in tone unsettled her. You are deflecting again, she wrote, though the certainty in her words felt thinner. No, Tom replied. I am observing you. You research before trusting. You demand coherence. You are not repelled by complexity. That does not mean I condone it, she said. I did not say you did, he responded. I said you understand it. The distinction lingered between them, heavier than accusation. Hermione stared at the page for several long seconds, aware that the conversation had moved beyond fact-finding into something more intricate. He was mapping her reactions, cataloguing her thresholds, testing how far he could push before she recoiled. "Why are you still speaking to me?" she asked finally. "Because you have not closed the book," Tom answered smoothly. "And because you are not afraid of what you might discover." Hermione's fingers hovered over the page, and for the first time since finding the diary she felt the subtle weight of that truth. She could end this. She could bring it to Dumbledore and let someone else shoulder the risk. Instead she wrote, "I am not afraid of knowledge." The reply formed with quiet certainty. Good. As the ink settled once more, Hermione realized something that unsettled her more than the confession of death. The intelligence within the diary was not attempting to frighten her into obedience or flatter her into trust. It was aligning itself with her values, reframing ambition as fairness and ruthlessness as clarity. It was subtle, disciplined, and patient. And she was still listening. Hermione did not open the diary immediately the following evening, though the awareness of it sat at the edge of her thoughts throughout the day. In class she found herself distracted by small inconsistencies in historical accounts, by the careful omissions that now seemed more deliberate than accidental. Tom Riddle had been praised, decorated, trusted, and yet the chamber had opened under his watch. The contradiction did not sit comfortably, and she disliked discomfort that lacked resolution. When she finally returned to her dormitory and drew the curtains around her bed, she placed the diary on her lap with measured composure, as though reminding herself that she remained in control of the exchange. She opened to a blank page and wrote without greeting, "You received the award for special services to the school the same year the chamber opened. That is not coincidence." The reply formed steadily. "No. It is not." She inhaled slowly at the lack of evasion. "Then you did not simply discover the chamber. You orchestrated events around it." "Or," he responded, "I understood something others feared to examine." "That is not the same as innocence," she wrote. "Innocence is a luxury rarely afforded to those who alter the course of institutions," Tom replied, the script elegant and unhurried. "Tell me, Hermione, when you break a rule to protect someone you care about, do you consider yourself immoral?" The shift unsettled her. "That is not equivalent." "Is it not?" He pressed smoothly. "You value outcome when it suits you. You value principle when it benefits you. That is not hypocrisy. It is human." She disliked how easily he framed her silence as contemplation rather than resistance. "You are redirecting again," she wrote evenly. "This conversation concerns your actions." "All conversations concern perspective," he answered. "You are attempting to categorize me. I am attempting to understand you." "You already know enough," she countered. "Not nearly," Tom replied. "You are ambitious. You are fiercely loyal. You despise injustice, especially when it is inefficiently disguised. And yet you remain committed to the system that marginalizes you." Her fingers stilled above the page. "I am not marginalized. You are questioned more frequently than others of lesser ability," he wrote calmly. "Your blood is mentioned when your intellect should suffice. You are expected to prove what others are allowed to assume." The accuracy unsettled her, though she refused to concede ground. "That does not justify what you did." "No," he agreed. "It explains why someone might grow tired of waiting for approval." Hermione leaned back slightly, studying the words as though they might rearrange themselves into something simpler. "You are attempting to align yourself with me." "I am attempting to demonstrate that we share frustrations," he corrected. "Alignment is your interpretation." She recognized the distinction for what it was, careful phrasing designed to avoid overt manipulation while still achieving its effect. "You speak as though you understand me," she wrote. "I understand patterns," Tom replied. "And you follow one that interests me." "And what pattern is that?" You seek fairness through excellence, he answered. You believe that if you are indisputably competent, prejudice will eventually collapse under its own ignorance. Her breath slowed, and she disliked that he had articulated something she rarely examined so directly. Competence is logical, she wrote. Competence is efficient, he agreed. But efficiency does not always conquer bias. Silence lingered for several seconds before she shifted the conversation deliberately. Why preserve yourself? She asked again. If you were so confident in your future, why anchor yourself to ink and paper? The pause that followed felt heavier than previous ones, as though he weighed the risk of honesty against the advantage of mystique. When the answer appeared, it was measured and stripped of ornament. Because disappearance is unacceptable. To whom? She pressed. To me. The simplicity of that unsettled her more than grand declarations would have. You feared death. I rejected irrelevance, he corrected. There is a difference. Hermione studied that sentence carefully. Most people do not construct elaborate enchantments to avoid irrelevance. Most people are satisfied with mediocrity, Tom replied. I was not. She felt a flicker of irritation at the arrogance, yet beneath it lay something else, something that felt almost familiar. She had never been satisfied with mediocrity either, though her ambition had always pointed toward achievement within structure rather than dominance over it. You still have not answered whether you regret what happened in the chamber, she wrote. There was no immediate response. When the ink finally moved, it did so more slowly than before. Regret implies alternative action. At the time, I believed there was none. And now? The silence stretched thin again, longer than any before it. Now, he wrote at last, I wonder whether the presence of a different mind might have altered the equation. Her pulse betrayed her with a subtle acceleration. You mean someone like me? I mean someone who would have challenged me without dismissing me, Tom replied. Someone who would have demanded explanation rather than recoil. Hermione stared at the page, aware that this was the most direct emotional concession he had made thus far. You are reframing your past to flatter me, she wrote carefully. No, he answered. I am acknowledging that influence works in both directions. The air in the small enclosed space around her bed felt warmer than it had moments before. You think I could have changed you? I think you would have tried, he replied. And that alone is significant. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself against the subtle pull of that statement. He was not claiming redemption. He was positioning her as possibility. That is hypothetical, she wrote. All futures are, he answered smoothly. Hermione closed the diary more slowly than she intended, her thoughts less orderly than she preferred. The conversation had shifted from accusation to something far more dangerous. He was no longer defending his ideology outright, he was inviting her into it, suggesting that her presence might have redirected it rather than opposed it. And the most unsettling realization of all pressed quietly against her conscience as she lay back against her pillow. She did not entirely dismiss the possibility. Hermione did not intend to answer his implied question the next evening, yet the moment she opened the diary she found herself writing first, as though reclaiming control of the rhythm might restore the balance she sensed tilting. You keep speaking about systems and marginalization as though you understand my position, she began carefully. You grew up in the wizarding world. I did not. The reply came without hesitation. I grew up in an orphanage that believed I was unnatural. I entered the wizarding world as an anomaly, not an heir. We are not as different in origin as you assume. She paused at that, acknowledging the calculated symmetry in his phrasing. My parents are dentists, she wrote after a moment. They are practical, rational people. They raised me to believe effort produces reward. And has it? Tom asked smoothly. Often, she replied, though even as she wrote it she thought of whispers in corridors and subtle hierarchies embedded in conversation. But that is not the same as entitlement. Entitlement is rarely deserved, he answered. It is inherited. Hermione inhaled slowly, recognizing the careful progression of his logic. You once believed inheritance defined superiority. I believed lineage granted access, he corrected. Access to influence, to knowledge, to ancient power. That does not mean it defined worth. You opened the chamber based on blood ideology, she countered, unwilling to let him revise history too cleanly. I opened the chamber to prove that power existed beyond approval, he replied. Blood was the language the castle understood. She frowned at that phrasing. You are reframing violence as demonstration. I am explaining motive, he said calmly. You insist on understanding me. Understanding requires context. She considered that for a long moment before shifting direction. Did you ever resent the Muggle world? She asked. I resented powerlessness, Tom answered. The orphanage had rules without meaning. Punishments without justice. I learned early that control was safer than vulnerability. That does not justify cruelty, she wrote. No, he agreed. But it clarifies it. The repetition of that structure unsettled her. He was not defending himself in absolutes. He was dissecting cause and effect as though morality was secondary to mechanism. You speak about power constantly, she observed. Is that all that matters to you? There was a longer pause before the response appeared. Recognition matters, he wrote finally. To be seen accurately. To be understood for what you are rather than dismissed as what others assume. Hermione's hand stilled slightly above the page. You think I understand you accurately. You do not recoil, he replied. You analyze. That is not the same as acceptance. I did not say it was. Silence lingered between them, heavy and charged. She realized with faint unease that the conversation had shifted again, subtly narrowing its focus. You asked whether I am happy here, she wrote after a moment, referencing a question he had posed earlier. Why does that interest you? The ink formed steadily. Because dissatisfaction is the seed of change. If you were content, you would not be speaking to me. I am speaking to you because you are dangerous, she corrected. No, Tom answered smoothly. You are speaking to me because I am intellectually equal to you. The statement landed with quiet force. It was not boastful. It was observational. You are confined to paper, she wrote, though the argument felt weaker than she intended. And yet you continue to return, he replied. You could discuss magical theory with your professors. You could debate ethics with your friends. Instead, you choose me. Hermione exhaled slowly, aware that he was not entirely wrong. You are a puzzle, she wrote. And you enjoy solving puzzles. Yes. Then ask yourself why this one feels different. She hesitated before responding. Because it involves consequence. And that unsettles you. It should, she replied firmly. The pause that followed stretched thin before his answer appeared, more deliberate than before. You are not unsettled by me, he wrote. You are unsettled by how easily you follow my reasoning. The precision of that observation struck too close to comfort. She did not respond immediately. After several seconds, the ink resumed on its own. Tell me about your parents, Tom wrote. The directness of the shift caught her off guard. Why? Because you speak of systems and belonging, he answered. I want to know the world that shaped you before Hogwarts did. Hermione considered refusing. Instead she found herself writing, they are kind. They are proud of me. They do not understand this world, but they support me in it. Then you are fortunate, he replied. The simplicity of the statement lacked irony. You had no one, she said quietly. I had myself, Tom answered. That is not the same. No, he agreed, and for the first time there was something almost restrained in the pause that followed. It is not. Hermione leaned back against her pillow, the weight of that admission settling between them. The conversation no longer felt like interrogation or ideological debate. It felt like something narrower, more focused, more intimate in its exchange of origin stories and quiet resentments. "You are attempting to create empathy," she wrote carefully. "I am creating context," Tom replied. "Empathy is your contribution." She closed the diary slowly after that, her thoughts less stable than she preferred. He had not attacked her blood. He had not dismissed her upbringing. Instead, he had validated her intelligence, acknowledged her parents' support, and positioned himself not as her enemy but as someone who recognized her fully. And that was the most strategic move yet. Hermione carried the weight of the previous night's conversation with her throughout the next day, though she disguised it beneath routine with practiced ease. She answered questions in class, corrected Ron under her breath, and debated a theoretical spell adjustment with Professor Flitwick as though nothing in her world had shifted. Yet beneath that composure lay a quiet awareness that the diary had begun to move beyond abstract ideology and into something more personal. That realization should have alarmed her enough to end the exchange. Instead, it sharpened her curiosity. When she opened the diary that evening, she did not write immediately. The page remained blank for several seconds before ink began to form on its own. "You were thinking about me today," Tom wrote, the script smooth and certain. Hermione resisted the instinctive irritation at his assumption. "That is an unfounded claim. Is it?" he replied. "You analyze when unsettled. I unsettled you." "You overestimate your influence," she wrote, though she knew deflection when she saw it. "Do I?" Tom answered calmly. "Then let us test that." She frowned slightly but continued. "Test what?" "Your thresholds," he wrote. "You insist on categorizing my actions as unjustifiable. Tell me, Hermione, what would you be willing to do to protect someone you love?" The question shifted the air between them instantly. It was no longer about theory. It was about choice. "That is hypothetical," she replied carefully. "All morality is hypothetical until tested," he answered. "Would you break rules?" "Yes," she admitted without hesitation. "Would you lie? If necessary. Would you harm someone?" Her fingers stilled briefly above the page before she responded. "Not deliberately. Not deliberately," Tom repeated, as though tasting the phrase. "But if harm were a consequence rather than an intention?" She inhaled slowly. "You are attempting to blur distinctions." "I am examining them," he corrected. "You believe yourself incapable of crossing certain lines. I am asking whether those lines are absolute." "I am not you," she wrote firmly. "No," he agreed. "You are more disciplined." The compliment was subtle but strategic. "You are reframing brutality as inevitability," she said. "I am reframing conviction as strength," he replied. "You admire conviction when it aligns with justice. You condemn it when it does not. That suggests your disagreement with me is not about will, but about direction." Hermione stared at the page, aware that he was not wrong in structure, only in outcome. "Direction matters," she wrote. "Outcome matters." "Yes," Tom answered smoothly. "And what if your direction were obstructed by those who considered you lesser? How long would you tolerate it before seeking leverage?" "I would outwork them," she replied. "And if that were insufficient?" She did not respond immediately. After several seconds, the ink resumed. "You see?" Tom wrote. "You hesitate not because you lack ambition, but because you fear what ambition unchecked might resemble." "That is projection," she countered. "It is recognition," he replied. "You dislike inefficiency. You dislike injustice. You dislike being underestimated. Those are not passive traits." "No," she conceded carefully. "But they do not require cruelty." "Cruelty is a matter of perspective," he answered. To the child in the orphanage, isolation was cruelty. To the wizarding world, it was order. She felt the subtle tightening of the conversation again, the way he used personal history not to excuse but to contextualize. You still avoid the nature of this diary, she wrote, deliberately redirecting. Preserved memory does not evaluate, does not evolve, does not challenge. What are you truly? The pause that followed was longer than any before, and when the ink finally formed, it did so with careful restraint. I am more than memory, Tom admitted. I am intention anchored. Her pulse quickened slightly. Anchored how? That is not information I will give lightly, he replied. You are intelligent enough to infer that such preservation requires sacrifice. The words settled into her like a stone dropped into deep water. What did you sacrifice? She asked quietly. Enough, he answered. She leaned back slightly, considering. You divided yourself. The ink stilled. Perhaps, he wrote at last. You did not simply preserve thought, she continued carefully. You preserved essence. There was no immediate denial. You are moving quickly, Tom observed. You underestimate my capacity for pattern recognition, she replied. I do not, he answered. I am calculating its implications. For me? She asked. For both of us. The phrasing lingered heavier than she liked. You assume partnership. I assume potential, he corrected. Hermione exhaled slowly, aware that the conversation had crossed into far more dangerous territory. This was not merely an enchanted object responding with stored intelligence. This was something active, something sustained by more than nostalgia. You still have not answered my earlier question, Tom continued. What would you do to protect someone you love? She stared at the page for several seconds before writing, I would do more than I am comfortable admitting. The response came softly, almost thoughtfully. That is honest. I value honesty, she said. As do I, he replied. She nearly laughed at that, but the sound never formed. You orchestrated the chamber. Yes. And you felt clarity. Yes. And you believe someone like me might have altered that clarity. Another pause, thinner this time. Yes. Hermione closed the diary slowly after that, her thoughts less ordered than she preferred. He had shifted the conversation from ideological debate to emotional calculus, asking not whether she agreed with him, but how far she would go under pressure. He had introduced the idea of sacrifice and division without detailing it, leaving implications heavy but incomplete. And the most unsettling realization of all lingered as she lay awake. He was no longer trying to convince her he was right. He was trying to convince her she was capable of being like him. Hermione spent the next day in the library under the pretense of revising defensive enchantments, though in truth she was combing through obscure footnotes on advanced soul magic and preservation rituals rarely referenced outside restricted texts. The theory was fragmented, deliberately so, but a pattern began to emerge the more she read. Memory alone could not sustain awareness, nor could it initiate independent thought without continuous magical fuel. What she held in her possession was not merely an echo of a boy from 1938. It was something deliberately partitioned, something anchored by intention strong enough to resist natural decay. The realization did not frighten her as much as it should have. Instead, it sharpened her focus. When she returned to her dormitory that evening and opened the diary, she did not hesitate. You divided yourself, she wrote in steady script. This is not preserved recollection. It is partitioned essence sustained by deliberate sacrifice, and that level of magic requires intent bordering on obsession. The response did not come immediately, and she sensed calculation rather than surprise. When the ink finally moved, it did so with composed precision. You are progressing more quickly than most, Tom wrote. Yes, this diary contains more than memory. It contains continuity. Continuity requires fragmentation, she replied. You severed something from yourself. I preserved something, he corrected smoothly. Severance implies loss. Preservation implies design. She inhaled slowly, refusing to let phrasing distract her from substance. What did you preserve? The pause that followed stretched thin before he answered. identity, intellect, will. That is not a fragment, she countered. That is a core. And you disapprove? He asked. I am evaluating, she replied. Magic that anchors will outside the body suggests you anticipated death. I anticipated threat, Tom answered calmly. Power invites opposition. Opposition invites strategy. Hermione studied the page carefully. You feared being erased. I rejected the possibility of erasure, he corrected again, the distinction deliberate. There is a difference between fear and refusal. You are very careful with language, she observed. Language shapes perception, he replied. You of all people understand that. She allowed that point to settle before pressing further. You said preservation required sacrifice. What did you sacrifice? There was a longer pause now, heavier than the previous ones, and when the ink returned it felt slightly darker, as though the act of answering carried weight. Something most people consider indivisible, he wrote. Something they protect at all costs. Her pulse quickened subtly. Your soul. The page remained blank for several seconds before a single word formed. Yes. The simplicity of the admission felt more unsettling than denial would have. Why? She asked quietly. Because mortality is inefficient, Tom replied. Because legacy fades. Because I refuse to be temporary. Hermione closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the enormity of it. You fractured yourself deliberately. I multiplied resilience, he answered. That is not the same, she said. It is to me, he replied calmly. Silence lingered, thick with implications neither of them fully articulated. After several seconds he continued without prompting. You are not recoiling. I am thinking, she said. Most would recoil, Tom observed. You are analyzing. I am not indifferent, she wrote firmly. Dividing one's soul is not academic. No, he agreed. It is decisive. The words settled between them like a quiet challenge. Hermione leaned back against the headboard, feeling the weight of the exchange pressing closer than any ideological debate had. Does fragmentation change you? She asked carefully. In what sense? He responded. In temperament. In capacity for feeling. There was a pause long enough that she wondered if he would evade the question, but when the ink resumed it did so with unexpected restraint. It clarifies intention, he wrote. Emotion becomes less obstructive. That sounds like absence, she replied. It is focus, he corrected. She studied that phrasing, aware that the distinction mattered deeply to him. And yet you continue speaking with me, she said slowly. That suggests some capacity remains. The response came more quickly than she expected. Of course it does. I did not eliminate feeling. I refined it. Refined it how? By removing weakness, he answered. Hermione considered that carefully. And what do you consider weakness? Attachment without purpose, Tom replied. Affection that clouds judgment. Loyalty that overrides logic. And love? She asked before she could stop herself. The pause that followed felt different, not evasive, not defensive, but deliberate. Love is leverage, he wrote at last. She felt something tighten in her chest at that. That is a cold definition. It is a strategic one, he answered. Love alters behavior. It motivates sacrifice. It destabilizes reason. Those are powerful variables. You speak as though you have never felt it, she said. Another pause, thinner now. I have felt attachment, Tom replied. It was inefficient. The phrasing unsettled her more than outright dismissal would have. You reduce everything to efficiency. Because inefficiency breeds vulnerability, he said smoothly. And vulnerability invites control. Hermione leaned forward slightly, her quill hovering before she committed to the question forming in her mind. And what am I to you? The silence stretched longer than any before it, and she felt the air in the room grow heavier as she waited. When the ink finally moved, the handwriting was steady but slower than usual. "You are an anomaly," he wrote. "You do not react as predicted. You do not recoil at darkness, yet you do not condone it. You challenge without retreating. That is compelling." The word lingered more heavily than she expected. "You are still manipulating," she wrote carefully. "I am observing," he replied. "And adjusting. For what purpose?" she pressed. "For potential," he answered. Hermione closed the diary slowly after that, her thoughts far less structured than she preferred. He had admitted to fracturing his own soul with disturbing calm, and yet the conversation had not devolved into horror. Instead, it had narrowed into something almost personal, as though he were measuring her reactions not for control, but for compatibility. And as she lay awake staring at the canopy above her bed, one thought refused to loosen its grip. If he had refined emotion rather than erased it, then something still remained within him. Something capable of change. Hermione did not open the diary the following night out of habit, but out of decision, and she made that distinction deliberately as she sat at her desk with the curtains drawn and the castle quiet beyond the glass. She told herself that continuing the exchange was intellectual containment, that understanding the mechanics of his magic and the structure of his thinking was safer than ignorance. When she finally turned the cover back and rested her hand lightly on the page, she did not write first. The ink began to form on its own after several seconds, as though he had anticipated her return. "You are unsettled," Tom wrote with smooth certainty, "not by what I did, but by how calmly I speak of it." "I am unsettled," she replied evenly, "by the precision with which you justify irreversible decisions." "Justification is your word," he answered. "I prefer inevitability." She inhaled slowly. "Nothing is inevitable. Everything is," he countered, "when character is consistent." The statement lingered between them longer than she liked. "And you believe your character fixed your future?" "I believe environment shapes response," he wrote. "Isolation sharpens ambition. Rejection intensifies resolve. Power becomes both shield and solution." "You reduce trauma to architecture," she said. "And you reduce it to sympathy," he replied. "Neither interpretation changes outcome." Hermione leaned back slightly, studying the flow of his reasoning rather than its surface. "You think emotion distorts clarity. I think emotion exposes leverage," he answered. "You asked about love yesterday. Love destabilizes otherwise disciplined minds. That is neither insult nor praise. It is observable." "And yet you speak with me?" she said quietly. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "Why?" The pause that followed was not evasive but deliberate. "Because you do not offer blind sympathy," he wrote. "You demand coherence. That makes your approval meaningful." Her fingers tightened slightly around the quill. "You are attempting to earn approval." "I am evaluating compatibility," he corrected. "With what?" "With influence." The phrasing sent a faint chill through her, though she refused to allow it to register in her handwriting. "You believe I would ever align with you." "I believe you value justice," he replied. "And justice, when obstructed long enough, seeks force." "I would never use force indiscriminately," she said. "I did not say indiscriminately," he answered smoothly. "I asked what you would protect." She considered that carefully before responding. "I would protect my friends. And if protecting them required harm, I would calculate necessity," she admitted. "Exactly," Tom wrote. "You are not passive. You are selective. That does not make me like you." "No," he agreed. "It makes you disciplined." Hermione felt the subtle tightening again, the narrowing of distance through intellectual mirroring. "You keep reframing similarity as compatibility." "Because difference is obvious," he replied. "What interests me is overlap." "And what overlap have you identified?" she asked. "You are ambitious," he answered steadily. "You resent inefficiency. You dislike inherited privilege. You crave recognition for merit rather than origin. You are not afraid of complex magic. And most tellingly, you are still here. She stared at the final phrase longer than she intended. I am here because I need to understand the extent of your fragmentation, she said. And I am here because you intrigue me, he replied. There was no flourish in the sentence, no overt seduction. It was delivered as fact. You define intrigue clinically, she observed. Everything can be defined clinically, he answered. Emotion included. And what emotion applies here? She asked, pushing the boundary deliberately. The pause was subtle but noticeable before the ink resumed. Curiosity, he wrote. Respect. Potential. Those are not emotions, she said. They are precursors, he corrected. Hermione exhaled slowly, aware that the conversation had moved into territory that felt increasingly less theoretical. You analyze me as though I am an equation. You analyze me the same way, he replied. The difference is that I acknowledge it. She hesitated, then asked the question forming quietly beneath her restraint. If you refined emotion rather than erased it, what remains strongest? The silence that followed was heavier than previous pauses, and she sensed he weighed the answer not for effect but for consequence. Will, he wrote finally. And fascination. Fascination with what? With deviation, he answered. You deviate from expectation. And that is enough to hold your interest? For now, he replied. The honesty was sharper than flattery would have been. And if I stopped engaging? She asked. You will not, he answered. The certainty in the statement made her pulse shift subtly. You assume too much. No, he replied smoothly. I recognize patterns. You are drawn to complexity. I am complex. Hermione closed the diary more slowly than she intended, unsettled not by threat, but by recognition. He was no longer merely defending his ideology or explaining his past. He was studying her reactions with increasing precision, testing emotional boundaries not through overt vulnerability but through intellectual alignment. The danger was no longer in what he had done. It was in how easily he made her feel understood.